Okay, let's go ahead and start then. Okay.
You ready?
You're on. You're on. It's running.
My name is Beverly Sanders, and today is Friday, January 10th, 2014. I'm visiting with Andy Paden and Terry Paden in McFarland Memorial United Methodist Church in Norman, Oklahoma. This interview is for the historical records of McFarland United Methodist Church, as well as the Voices of Oklahoma United Methodism project of the Oklahoma Conference Oral History Research Program, which is coordinated through the Commission on Archives and History with the support of the Oklahoma United Methodist Historical Society. Due to the nature of their experiences with McFarland, I'll visit with each individually for a few minutes and then talk with both of them about the role they played in McFarland as a couple. So Terry, we're going to talk with you first, and I just want to invite you first, just introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship, your connection with McFarland.
Okay. My mom and dad and brother and I moved to Norman in 1975, and my grandparents, 1975.
75.
My grandparents, Cal and Ruth Alexander, were members here, and that is when we moved our membership from St. Paul United Methodist in Muskogee to here. And I started coming for Sunday school and for church, and we did confirmation in 6th grade, and Phil Finn was here then, one of the first confirmation classes, I believe, and became involved in every aspect of the church as a youth from that time.
Okay. And you said that you were, how old was that when you came?
So I was 7 years old, first grade.
7 years old, okay, first grade. So I was going to ask you then what it was like growing up in McFarland. So you didn't quite completely grow up here in McFarland, but here from the time you were 7 on?
Yes.
Tell us about a little bit more detail about your time here at McFarland as a child.
Yes. Well, when we used to do confirmation starting in 6th grade, and I was saying Phil Finn had maybe that was his first or second year here, but I was thinking we were one of his first confirmation classes, and his own son Dale Finn, so we were the same age, and we were in that class together. And I remember that he and Gloria Jean helped prepare us in confirmation. I was in the choir. The children's choir was with Dr. John Yarrington, and then once middle school we had Dr. Perry White. And my first youth pastor was Roy Bendur, and I believe he was my youth pastor almost all the way up through graduation. So I also, and I was in bells with, help me remember, he was a principal at Longfellow, and he was also a music director.
Is that who you said?
Who?
You said
no,
what?
I'll think of him in a moment.
Oh.
But our youth group was one of the first to go on mission trips, and we did the Appalachian Service Project. And we are also the first to go on an international trip when we went to Great Britain and sang and did a Wesley tour then as well. With choir and handbells and youth and camps at Canyon and Camp Egan, felt like I had a real full leadership and youth experience and music. Yes.
So you were growing up at an exciting time, because that was a lot of the things getting started that I believe had not been being done before, were they?
Right.
There were a lot of new things going on. Tell us a little bit more about the generations of your family in this church. How many generations have been active here at one time?
Right. There was a time when there were 4 of us here. My grandparents, Cal and Ruth Alexander, my mom and dad, Tim and Pat Stewart, Andy and I, and our daughters, Sydney and Anna Carmen, were both baptized here by Phil Finn. And my brother and his wife, Lisa, Tracy and Lisa Stewart, they moved from Dallas, and they're members here with their 3 children as well. But there was a time when there were 4 of us all together.
4 generations at once.
Yes, 4 generations.
That's a pretty good record.
Right. We were proud of that.
How did your grandparents come to be in Norman and at McFarland? I know, didn't your grandmother grow up in Norman?
My grandmother did grow up in Norman, and my grandfather was Marine, career Marine for 25 years, so they traveled, but home was always Norman for them, and that's where they met, actually. And my grandfather grew up Presbyterian, and my grandmother, I think in the military, they do kind of a...
You do chapel?
Yeah, chapel. Okay. But when they came to Norman, they visited a few churches. I think they visited a Presbyterian church, and they visited McFarlin, and they loved what McFarlin had.
Now, what did you say your grandmother grew up as what? In what church?
I
don't know. You didn't? Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. But somehow they managed to choose McFarland.
Yes.
And we've already talked about the youth program, so I won't ask you that again. When you became a high school student and then college graduate, what activities were available?
You're going to mention that I was your student in 8th grade math, though, at middle school.
You were first. Yes, one of my prize students. I'm always proud to claim. Terry Paden, oh yes.
That's right.
And Daphne Fix.
Yes, that's right.
Then when you got into high school then, and then afterward you graduated from college, what was available to you activity-wise as a young adult in McFarland?
Well, I did. They had a college singles class, and I remember that I did that for a year or two, and we all just kind of took turns leading it, so I don't remember who led us in that. And I was in the adult choir for a little bit too, so I continued in college to still keep the connection.
Yeah, you did go to college here at OU.
At OU.
Did you do anything at the Wesley Foundation when you were a student?
No, I continued. Clarice Moore, after Roy retired, there was actually someone in between, but then, anyway, I think Clarice Clarice Smith, and then she got married. Clarice Moore was the youth director, and so during college I was an intern, half-time youth director.
Oh.
And went on mission trips here, as a college student here.
No, I never knew that. Not
when we called it MYF, also Methodist Youth Fellowship. Yes. The girls laugh when I call it MYF.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I'm not sure if we talked about this. Have you ever been a member of any other church besides McFarland?
Just in Muskogee.
Just in Muskogee.
Yes.
And that was a Methodist church too.
Yes.
There. Anything else that we should mention about your life before it merged with Andy's?
Before we merged with Andy. Just that this was my other home, and this is everything I could do. Like I said, from choir to handbells to youth to continuing to work with the youth even in college. It was just a place that I wanted to be.
So we were already well into all those good music programs, the bells and everything by that time.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Okay, Andy, we're next ready for you.
Okay.
Introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your history as a young person and before you, and how you got connected with McFarland.
Great. My name is Andy Paden. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I grew up in Sand Springs, Oklahoma. That was where I did my growing up, and I've been active in church my entire life. My mom and dad made sure that we as a family went to church on a regular basis. For the first, 18 years of my life, I was an active participant in Broadway Baptist Church in Sand Springs. It's where my grandparents went to church, where my dad grew up going to church. And I accepted Christ as my personal Savior when I was 12. We didn't do confirmation like we do here at the Methodist Church, but I made that individual profession of faith when I was 12. And grew up active in the youth group and choir. I mean, Terry and I had very similar childhood experiences in church. My youth group, my youth pastor, these are wonderful experiences and powerful influences in my life, and a lot of my friendships and relationships were with people that I went to church with. So that was good. But I left Sand Springs to come to the University of Oklahoma, and that's where I did my 4 years of education. And I think I may have attended McFarland once or twice during that time. I came with a fraternity brother of mine who was Methodist, and so that was my very first exposure to McFarland. And I went to a variety of different churches as I was exploring it. After graduation, I got a job here in Norman at the Norman Chamber of Commerce. So my home was becoming Norman, so I was wanting to find a church home. And not too long after I started working in Norman, I met Terry. I knew her mom and dad before I knew her, and we were very active in the community together. And we were at a charitable fundraising event with Terry's mom and dad, and that's how I came to meet Terry for the first time.
I see.
So I don't know, we stayed in contact a little bit, but about a year later we started dating on a regular basis, and it's really been non-stop since then. Yeah, and so naturally she was coming to church. Her mom and dad, were beginning to be more active in McFarland at that time. Of course, her grandmother, grandfather, Cal and Ruth, were very active here. So it just became a regular routine that on Sunday mornings we would just come to church at McFarland. We did not have a Sunday school class yet that had formed, but we were going. We would sit with Cal and Ruth in the pew. And we got married here shortly after. We dated for maybe a year or so before we got engaged. We were engaged about 9 months. So,
So you had your wedding.
We had our wedding here.
When
Phil
was that?
Finn. That was in 1993, June 19th, 1993. And Phil conducted the wedding. Sam played the organ, the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. And we had a soprano trumpet. And because of Terry's involvement in the youth program, she was an intern, as she said, and Vanita and her involvement with the handbell, the bell choir, the youth bell choir actually played in our wedding as well. So it was just great to have the McFarland Bell Choir be part of our wedding. So we were married and we were living our lives together. Now there was a short time, about 3 years, that I was in Midwest City at the Chamber of Commerce. And so Terry and I's newlyweds moved to Midwest City, and we were there for a little while, but I think our church membership never left McFarland, and we continue to be regular.
What church were you involved with in Midwest, or did you go to any?
We lived in Midwest City, but we drove to Norman every Sunday to come to church. In fact, it was during that time of our lives that the Sunday school class that we're actively involved in now formed. That's the Commitments Sunday School class. It formed 20 years ago, and we've been married 20 years. So it formed just a couple of months after. It formed on really OU Texas weekend. That was the first official weekend. And I think the majority of the 5 or 6 couples that started that class are still active.
Bill and Karen
Short
started it.
We had Mark and Lynn McGuire, Tyler and Leslie LaRue,
Lori and Chad
Ely,
and then Joe and
Jackie Rogers, who are now living in Nashville. So anyway, that was the core that kind of started, and it has grown, and it has divided. I mean, it has become
divided into about 3 classes.
Probably about 3. It's really, I think it really played a great part for people our age. We counted recently how many children have been born to the people that have come through the Commitments class. Hundreds, literally. Hundreds of kids have come through the Commitments class and become members of McFarland, active in McFarland. So. And
did I understand you said that you thought most of those original people were still active in McFarland?
Yes, and I would even consider Jackie and Joe to still be active in McFarland, even though they don't live here. I think they'll probably be back someday. But,
so that class is responsible for us having a very active young people's group these days.
Well, I think God had His hand in making sure that the next generation of McFarlandites were raised up, and if there had not been a Sunday school class begin so successfully, then maybe we wouldn't have such a vibrant next generation coming up. Now, we're not taking credit for that. I'm saying the church knew that there needed to be another class formed for that age group, and there was obviously a need because we all responded really well. Our dearest friends are part of that class.
Now, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask if Kathy is the one that had instrumental in forming it.
Kathy,
it was Karen's aunt.
Yeah, Kathy Mash did, and then Karen Short's aunt, Anona Adair, who was active in the church at that time. I think, yeah, she was very instrumental. The idea arose out of a conversation they were having. And I think on a couple of occasions previous to that, there had been an attempt to start a class. But I think just the chemistry was right. All the different elements were right at that time. And it really took off great. We started growing, and it was just a neat experience. Continues to be a neat experience today.
Wonderful. Now, am I correct that that you are still with the Chamber of Commerce here in Norman now, or are you still in other organization?
No, ma'am. I worked for Chambers of Commerce early on. We left Midwest City. Actually, we had Sydney when we were living in Midwest City, and when she was a small baby, I accepted a position. Actually, I accepted the position before she was born, just a couple of months before she was born. I came back and I was the United Way director here for about 9 years.
United Way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I'm in private business now, but
so you're not still United Way?
I am just a contributor, yes,
just a
and a supporter, but not an employee any longer.
Okay.
But that was, I guess I would say one other thing is maybe a transitional comment. That commitments class began, and we all began to be very dedicated and solid members of this great church. And I think, to the great credit of our church and our leadership, they began to realize that there existed in that class some leadership potential too. And so within a couple of years of us kind of beginning that class, suddenly a lot of those members began to become part of the leadership structure of this church, and I think have contributed greatly and have just made their own views and ideas become part of the church's history. And so I think there was a time when we kind of looked back on what our involvement had been, and we realized how involved that particular group of Sunday school members had become.
And as far as getting the young people involved in the, having been on several nominating committees, the ministers have been very purposeful in reminding the nominating committee to keep these young people in mind, because this is our future.
Right.
And to make sure that they...
And it's such a wonderful opportunity to serve on these committees with multiple generations of our church. It's a great way for the generations of our church to connect to each other.
There's one story that I was going to ask you to tell that Joe thinks is a great story and rather serendipitous in its effects. But we'd like for you to tell us about your participation in the men's prayer breakfast, and in particular how you happened to meet Joe Sanders there.
Yeah.
Well, the men's prayer breakfast is well known. It's been around a long time, 50 years I think is what we celebrated recently. And they meet early on Wednesday mornings. The church bulletin says that the men's prayer breakfast meets at 6:30 a.m. But that is a lie. It does not meet at 6. It's over at 6:30 a.m. You have gentlemen lining up for their biscuits and their eggs at 5:30 a.m. There's no question it starts way before that. But many of my friends were beginning to be involved in the men's prayer breakfast, another multi-generational activity of our church. And so us young bucks were getting involved at that time, and about once a year, somebody would shake your hand on Sunday mornings, and there would be a set of keys in that handshake. And that meant next Wednesday is your day to come, and you have to buy the breakfast, and you have to prepare the breakfast and get everything open, and you have to deliver the message, the lesson, the devotional for that day. It doesn't have to be long, but it has to be, something spiritual, so that we can get our day off to a good start. So I believe I got the handshake one Sunday around, I want to say it was probably close to Veterans Day. And I've never served in the armed forces. Neither did my dad. For some reason, we just weren't the right age. The draft didn't get us, or whatever. But my grandfather did serve in World War II, and in fact, he lost his life in World War II. He was killed in action on Christmas Eve, 1944. So I thought I would honor my grandfather and Veterans Day and have a religious meeting, because my grandfather was an extremely religious man. He has kind of a neat story. So I thought I'd share that story with the men's prayer breakfast. And so when I mentioned my grandfather's name, his name was George Washington Paden. Very presidential sounding. His name's George Washington Paden. And I delivered that message, and immediately after the prayer breakfast had ended, Joe Sanders came up to me and shook my hand. I guess Joe's very interested in genealogy and the like, and he knew that on his mother's side there was a family, a Paden, and a George Washington Paden. So it's at that moment that we realized that we were cousins. We were distant cousins. And so if I could borrow the family tradition of Joe and say, our family has been a member of McFarlin for many, many years. It was a great coincidence. And every time I see Joe, even to this day, we call each other cousin, and we remember that time at the men's prayer breakfast. Yeah.
And I don't understand the family tree business well enough to know exactly what kind of cousins, second cousins.
I think, yeah, Joe knows. I think his mother, was your mother a Paden?
Yes, it was her first cousin.
Yeah.
Which would be my second cousin.
Right. So we're probably fourth cousins or fifth cousins, but I guess Joe's mother and my grandfather were first cousins. So
that's interesting.
It's not too distant. It's close enough to draw the line.
Of course, I remember that he was killed in World War II.
Yeah.
Which was really, as soon as he said that and the name and everything, I said, wait a minute.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else that you think of that's particularly oriented to you and your activities and your connection here with McFarland?
I would only add, I think, that today, Terry and I, we kind of team teach, but I get to deliver the message. But I'm one of the Sunday school teachers of the commitments class. And I think I would just add that participating in Sunday school class is one thing. It's a wonderful thing. But participating and sharing the responsibility of teaching the class heightens the experience. And it's like anything. To know something is to know something, but to know something well enough to teach it and share it requires a great deal more effort. And so I kind of honestly dread those 2 Sundays sometimes as it begins to be my responsibility, but they're always the richest 2 weeks of my spiritual life because I'm thinking about it, I'm preparing for it, I'm trying to figure out what God has for me to say, and those are always meaningful times leading up to those days I teach.
Does the class have a regular rotation of teachers, or just kind of make it up as you go along? Or?
No, we have a regular rotation. There's 4 of the original couples that we discussed earlier share the responsibility. The McGuires, the LaRues, the Elys, and the Padens are the 4 couples that just sort of share that responsibility. We teach 2 weeks in a row, and we rotate that responsibility regularly.
Joe and Jackie had taught it, I think, almost 7 years, and then they went. Then they
had a sabbatical. They had some time overseas that they had to pay. So it was up to us to kind of take the ball.
Incidentally, Chad Ely was another one of my students.
Good.
He doesn't say much about it though.
And it was Mr. Hingst, who was the other Bell director. I was trying to think. He was also our principal. He was principal there. His son.
Assistant principal there for a while.
Yes, the assistant.
Very good one too, I might say. Okay, are we ready to go into your together?
Yes, ma'am.
Terry, I first had asked Andy about, no, I didn't ask him that, about chairing, being a member of commissions and committees. What commissions and committees have you served on or chaired or been a part of?
The nomination committee, which has a new name now, but nomination committee I've been on 3 times, actually, many times, and I really enjoy that committee. And I've also served on SPRC. And another one, I'm trying to remember, but it's the Traditional and the Lifeline.
Worship committee?
Thank you, worship committee. The worship committee. So those are some committees. And I participated in the prison ministry for 3 years, and one Sunday every month with Jane Anderson and whose room did we borrow there for a while? News, who was our employee. Anyway, there were several folks that were a part of it. And Polly Sandlin.
Polly Sandlin.
Yeah,
Bill Chisso.
And so that was also very meaningful.
So you were very busy.
Yeah.
And I skipped that question with you, Andy. What committees and commissions have you served on or chaired?
I'm currently involved with the McFarlin Foundation, and that's very rewarding. It's kind of an affiliated organization of McFarlin. We only exist for the benefit of McFarlin. And you know what, I really have, I've done a few things here and there in the past, but really I tend to get involved in some of the larger kind of short-term projects like the Spirit is Building campaign. It's been 6 to 18 years since we did that, but that was kind of a short-term but large type event. But that's how I prefer to be involved as opposed to an ongoing commitment. I like to get involved in short-term things.
I see. So you just projects here and there.
Yes.
I see.
Yes.
And teaching Sunday school.
I'm sorry.
And teaching Sunday school.
I'm going to ask you, each of you, to first Terry and then Andy, describe your feelings as you were growing up here about the congregation, the building. Is there any sentimental attachment to this old building that's been here, sitting here since 24? I guess we're getting close to 100 years now.
There is a sentimental attachment. This is my church. It's my home church. It's where my family is, as we've discussed. I would like to say I've never taken its beauty, the structural beauty, for granted, and what we have in this church with our organ. But I think the biggest impression is the year we did get married in 1993, when Andy's people, when his kin and folk came.
All my people came from Tulsa.
From Tulsa, and to hear them and to see them walk into the church and experience its beauty, and to get to hear the organ and the bells and the things that we've talked about, they just loved this church right away too, and reminded me what a great place it is.
I want to add, one of our family friends from my hometown happened to also be the church organist of the church that I grew up in. So naturally they came to the wedding, and it was not unusual for her to pay close attention to what was happening on the organ. And she told us right after that is the most beautiful organ she has ever heard. And she's been to many, many places. And we know that it's a wonderful instrument. We know that it has that reputation. But to actually hear people who kind of know what they're talking about brag on it like that too, it's fun.
And we were with the current organ at that time. We had,
yes,
our quote new organ at that time.
Right. And also along the line of music, something else, again, you know it, but with our handbell choir, it was something that I grew up hearing and participating in. When we would travel with choir tours with Dr. Perry White, the congregation's response to hearing the bell choirs was also what a treat it was for the bell choirs. So it's something I've had the opportunity and blessing to grow up with. But when you realize that other people appreciate it so much.
Was John Yarrington pretty much the one who started the choir trips?
I remember Dr. Yarrington more in my elementary, so once I got into, but he may have been the ones who started it.
So he was not
I think
working
he
with the
had
old
possibly
group like you were.
I think it's Perry White that started.
Do you think so?
Maybe. And we called Perry Coach. That was something that our group kind of like the. No, it wasn't Coach, it was Chief.
Chief?
Yeah, we called him Chief, so that was our nickname for Perry. Some names, if I may, I was remembering some of my youth group friends who some of them still have some ties here, but my age was Del Finn, Bill and David Chisso, Karen Goodman, who's still a member here. I was trying to remember some of the, Debbie Hammond and her mom Maryland is still a member here. So those were some friends from my youth that I still connect with and who still have connections here.
And how about you, Andy? The same question as far as your feelings about the church and the congregation as a group.
Well, I've spent a lot of time in the community, with the Chamber of Commerce, I mean, I've always been a community guy since I've been here, and so I'm out and about, and I have, an opportunity to brag on my church and how beautiful it is, but everybody knows about McFarland, whether they go to church or not, because it's just such a beautiful structure. And I'm aware of the story of how the church was built and the generous gift from the McFarlin family. We selected the spot of land and we positioned the church so that our doors faced the university. And so just because of the location, just the structure of the church, it's large and beautiful, but it's not intimidating. It just has a quality about it that I think those open doors just invite you to come in. So, we can be talking to people that are familiar with Norman, but it may not live here, and I can give them directions of where to go by telling them, the big limestone church down on my campus. Well, it's 3 blocks east or 2 blocks north, and everybody knows about McFarlin.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. I love it.
When did you begin to realize, I know that it's possible to be in a building, as you said, and love it so, and not to realize that it's beginning to grow old? When did you all first become aware that there were some things?
When we started our Sunday school in 1993, we started it in a bar across the street, which we loved. That was part of our history. There was no room in the church. We didn't have a place. It was necessary that there was, as we were saying, that there was a Sunday school set up for newlyweds, but we didn't have any place to go. So we started it. It was called Winchester's Bar. It was fun coming up with names for our class. Of course, we settled on the commitments. Yeah,
we kind of had an agreement with Winchester's. I think Winchester's during the week was allowed to use some of McFarland's parking.
I believe so.
And so McFarland said, fine, we need your space on Sunday morning to have a Sunday school class meet. And so that was the beginning of that. I think I'd add on top of that is that shortly after we became a Sunday school class, we started reproducing. We started having babies. And it began to be logistically difficult for the parents of infants to be located across the street. So they began immediately looking for places that could be a meeting space for us. And we've met on stairway landings before. We've done a lot of interesting things.
Back of the sanctuary.
There was a year where we actually had a Sunday school class inside the McFarland nursery. We met in a classroom inside the nursery. So it wasn't until we built the addition on the building that we had sufficient classroom space for everybody who needed a classroom to actually have one.
Along in the 80s or 90s, I think there were some fundraisers and some repairs and improvements made from time to time before we really even talked about an addition to the church. Do you remember anything about those, and did you have any active part in any of that fundraising? I think that's long back when we put the elevator on up to the 4th floor and did a lot of repainting and repairs and things downstairs and put in the
80s and 90s. Andy and I started really as a couple and being involved more on that, that side of the church. More early
92,
90s.
93.
That's right. This was earlier, I guess, while you were still teenagers.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And when did you begin to hear that McFarland needed more space? Well, you just told me about that. You were part of that needing more space.
Right.
How seriously do you think at that time were these problems being taken by the people in power in the church who
I think very seriously. I mean, right away it started to develop. We needed room. There was talk of having our Lifeline, which is a contemporary worship. We needed space for that. We needed updated space and daycare for our children, and I felt the timing for us, it was taken very seriously. And
right, and of course the church was talking about it. Here's my recollection. Here's my perspective. I think Phil Finn had an awful lot to do in a very positive way to get our church headed in that direction. And Phil and I have had a chance to talk about these things, especially when we were contemplating the campaign. And I really believe that the Holy Spirit was moving him toward undertaking this campaign. Well, it was the right thing. We needed to do it. It was necessary for the future of our church. But I think he had in sight the end of his ministerial career. I think he knew that this would be the appropriate legacy of his tenure as pastor. If he had not built the building, then we would have still loved him as much as we love him. But the very fact that we named a big piece of this building after him and Gloria Jean, I think is just a living testament to how meaningful his leadership, both spiritually, administratively, is for this church. And so I think he realized that it was time, that all the talk, all the preliminary discussions had led to this moment where he stood up and he said, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to do it seriously. And so I think we did it right. But I really think it's Phil's vision and leadership that once he said, folks, we're going to do this. The Lord has told us it's time to do it. His expression has always been in the fullness of time, in the fullness of time. And so it was God's timing that brought us as a church to that point. And I think everybody knew that and sensed that and knew it was a spirit-filled activity. And so we all just got in line, got on board, and all headed in the same direction. It was a great time in our church history.
And how about, what can you tell me about when the two of you were tapped to be some active part of this Spirit is Building campaign? About when was this, and what was it you were asked to do?
Well, it was shortly after we were married. It was in a couple of years, so it was probably 93, 94. And we were blown away. I mean, honored. But I think, as we were saying earlier, the decision makers knew that it was important to have several generations represented in the effort. And from a leadership perspective, probably nobody better than Marion and Diane Bauman to be a leader in that effort. And Terry and I were happy to represent the new and upcoming generation, but it was definitely a Diane and Marion, led committee. But we jumped in, we helped with our perspective, and we worked hard, both of us. Terry's pregnant at the time, so
Terry,
yeah, she was pregnant with Sydney at the time, so sometimes I needed to go out and do some of the meetings on my own, but we were all definitely, the four of us, in it together. And this may or may not be the time you want to hear about it, but the whole strategy, which I think worked beautifully, was that this was such a huge undertaking that we really needed to involve a lot of people. In fact, I think most everybody in the church were involved at some level in making the campaign and the effort successful, so that when it came time to make a financial commitment, everybody had so much legitimate involvement in the process that we all were invested. We were all completely invested. And I remember this, we never talked about numbers so much. We talked about sacrificial giving. And that's what these things are about. We have to continue to make our tithes and our offerings to church because the church had to continue operating. But the question was, what sacrifice as members of McFarland, of families, are we willing to make over and above what our normal commitment might normally be so that we can realize this goal? And the numbers, again, aren't very important, but the experts out there that helped us coordinate our fundraising efforts thought that we might be able to raise about what our annual budget was. And at that time, let's just say it was $1.5 million. So the experts, the outside experts, told us that we should anticipate being able to raise about that in our fundraising over a couple of years' time. Well, I think we raised 3 times that. And I think just the outpouring of sacrifice that the church members gave speaks to the fact that we were ready, speaks to the fact that we were led, not only by our lay leadership, but our pastor and God. The Holy Spirit led our church members into this new promised land, so to speak. And when we began to realize what our church was willing to give for the future of this church, it was a spiritual experience in and of itself. It was just a blessing to be part of, God working in that way. And in this case, it happened to be money. that was given.
Uh-huh.
I mean, those are the resources that it takes to build a building like we did. And for the first time in our congregation's history, the first time, we had to muster enough resources on our own to do something. Remember, the McFarlands paid for the first building. We were good stewards of that gift. We've worked really hard to make sure that gift is preserved and made available to future generations. But we needed more space, and so that was our own bootstraps that we reached down into and came up with. So we are what we are today because of that time, I think.
Wonderful. So, any particular memories then once the money was raised about the building of the building?
Tell them about the groundbreaking.
Right, I remember I guess more of the photographs of the groundbreaking, and I think my grandparents, I think was it a generational thing? But my grandparents and Sydney and Andy and I.
There was 4 generations. There was the shovel.
You had the shovels and the
I didn't
hats.
realize that when I was asking you about the 4 generations. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Right.
So you all participated as a...
Part of
Yeah,
that.
they staked the footprint of the building out, I remember. Just with ribbon and wooden stakes, so that we would get a sense of, in this vacant lot will be this new space. And we had people standing on ladders representing what would be happening on the 2nd floor. And we had other people stationed throughout, and people, I think they dressed up, if I recall, they'd have their chef's hat on, and they were standing in what would soon be the kitchen. Those kind of things. We had baby rattles in the places that would soon be the expanded nursery. And so it kind of helped the congregation begin to visualize the physical space.
We have a wonderful set of pictures of that showing
Yeah.
Sharon way up on the ladder for the kitchen. And
Right.
I don't remember who else is doing what. But
Right. I miss her rolls.
I was going to say, how did we forget to talk
And
about Sharon?
I think that whole idea was
Rolls.
Kathy Mash's inspiration.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
she's
That
very
was great.
creative.
Very
Yeah.
creative, yeah.
Let's see here.
Okay, so I remember that once construction began, we were still having church in the middle of what amounted to a pretty serious renovation. So we lost some classroom space as a result of the renovation, but of course we were gaining a bunch of new space once the renovation be completed. But there was that 2-year period of time where we were all transitioning. It seemed like everybody's attitude remained upbeat and happy because of the promise of the new building that we were going to have. But again, people were meeting on stairway landings and across the street again. We went back to the bar at that time.
Yeah.
I guess our kids had grown up old enough, to...
Now the Winchesters, is now Step Brothers.
It is Step
Okay,
Brothers.
right, same place.
And it's not a bar on a permanent basis anymore. It's just space now.
Yeah.
So.
What about the Palm Sunday at Lloyd Noble?
Mm.
Any special memories of that?
You spoke at it.
Yeah, that's a very, very special Sunday in our life, but it was a special Sunday in my life too. It was a worship service that we had at Lloyd Noble, and we kind of portrayed it to our membership as a good old-fashioned church picnic type atmosphere. We were going to have worship at Lloyd Noble. If anybody's ever been connected with McFarland, now would be the time to come to worship. And we did a pretty good job filling up the largest venue in our town. And then we had boxed lunches for everybody afterward, and so that was all good. But I remember the worship service, and I remember speaking at the worship service. And I do quite a lot of public speaking, so that wasn't something that was intimidating to me, but I did have a deep sense of appreciation for that moment and what it meant in the life of our church. And I remember coming up with an example in my mind. It just seemed like that, there are certain moments in our lives where we are particularly tuned in to hearing what God has planned for us. He's always talking and whispering to us. But whether or not we have the opportunity, the ability to listen, to really listen, those only happen, unfortunately, occasionally through our life. And I felt like as a church, I used the example of we're all on a big church bus, and we have the radio tuned to a religious station, and we're going up a windy road through the mountains, and the reception on the radio is not great, and you go into tunnels, in and out of tunnels, and sometimes you lose the signal altogether. But there are those moments when you break out of a tunnel into the clear, and the radio reception is perfect, and you can hear on the radio without any static or any background noise. You hear with absolute clarity what's coming through on the radio. And so I described that moment in our church's lives as that moment where we've burst from a tunnel and we hear with absolute clarity what God had for us to hear. And at that moment, I felt like every face in the crowd was tuned in 100%. And then we passed the hat.
Yeah.
And I think people, and there was one gentleman that came up to me afterward and said, I was planning to give X, but after I heard what you had to say, I gave 3 times that amount. So to me, that is God moving in amongst the midst of our church. And I think people got it and realized that this was our moment and gave accordingly. Yeah.
Well, as a member of the congregation at the time, I believe that, I think you're exactly right. I think all of us really felt it was just an inspiring time.
Yeah.
Not only the Lloyd Noble, but the whole campaign.
Just being together in one spot at one time. I thought that was so wise for whoever chose. I think Phil probably wanted us all to be at Lloyd Noble. Because that'd be the one place where we could all get together.
And I think that, and this is not a time for my opinions, but to me, the church has kept that spark. And that's why we have so many wonderful things going on now. Some, what is it now, 13 years after we moved into the new edition.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree.
Any particular memories about getting the congregation moved in? That's a blank spot in my memory, and I was wondering if you all remembered much about it.
I remember regarding Lifeline.
Yeah.
Our Sunday school class was asked and encouraged. Some of you, we all of course had attended traditional, and that's what brought us to this church, and that's why we were here. But they had asked us, soon we're going to be having our Lifeline. I don't know if they've named it yet, but our contemporary worship. And
started in the sanctuary.
they asked a few classes, I don't remember, but commitments being one of them. Could you all attend? And we need bodies and we need people. Could you
to
all
seed the congregation? Go make a commitment there.
Right.
And
Which we did start the contemporary in the traditional church at a different time, and then moved over to.
And it was happening simultaneously
right.
then. That was the big
That was
switch.
Something I remembered about moving, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember anything about all of the problems that kept popping up with the construction, that kept delaying and delaying and delaying?
Well, I don't remember so many problems, but I do remember participating in meetings. And again, it is amazing to see how a congregation like ours, filled with different people and personalities and experiences and backgrounds, to come together to try to agree on what the space would look like.
Like the Atrium?
I just know that the Atrium was a spot of controversy. First of all, we didn't have anything like that in our old building, our original building. And I think that there was this desire to have that great common space where we could all see and meet each other. The only place where you saw people in the original building was on the stairway, going up and down. We'd pass each other in the stairway. So to have a space where we could all just mingle and fellowship before, we all knew we wanted that, but I don't know that we knew we could agree on what it was going to look like. And I think there was some ideas that, because we didn't invent an atrium. Atriums existed long before we built ours. But I think atriums in the past were fraught with problems. Those windows always leaked, and they weren't as heavy duty as they needed to be, but our engineers felt
Will
like
it fit in with the architecture
would
that
it
we
work?
have?
Would it be too modern? All those things.
Right.
Now, I would say that once we moved in and we could all see the finished product, nobody
Yeah.
disagreed with that space. Once we were in, people just loved it, and that ability to get together and have donuts and fellowship before has also been a transformative thing about our church. And again, that's where I can see you guys every Sunday morning. Multiple generations get to see and interact together on that Sunday morning. So it's funny how a space like that can have a direct positive impact on the ministry of this church.
Isn't that
It
amazing?
goes together hand in hand.
We hear that being said all the time. How did we ever get along without that?
Without
I know.
How did I know people
Right.
without
Yeah,
having a
exactly.
space like that?
Right.
Well, do either of you think of anything specifically about the campaign and the building of the new addition, anything like that we have not mentioned that you think should be mentioned?
Well, when you were talking earlier about when did we feel crowded, I was remembering our Thanksgiving dinners and our Christmas dinners, that
Oh,
we would
yes.
have to have them on different nights down in Meyer Hall, down in the basement.
Each one 2 nights.
That's where a lot of wedding receptions would be
That's a
done in
good
Meyer
point.
Hall. And so again, we couldn't
That's a
all
good
meet
point.
at the same time. We couldn't have a dinner at the same time. So now we can all have those kind of dinners and gatherings in the same space. So
Well, I
that's
have
so
no
important.
idea if anybody today is talking about another building expansion. But I know that back in the day, we had envisioned another phase of growth. And I'd be the first one to say, McFarland's probably ready for the next one, whatever that is. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to pull up and have some kind of covering where we could let our loved ones out without getting wet? So maybe some kind of what are those called?
Portico.
A little portico or something like that. What about a wedding chapel? Something very nice and smaller. What about, what those spaces are called where we could have the saints of our church be forever part of this facility through columbarium or something. I mean,
There is a master plan that was done back there sometime. I
Yeah.
don't remember exactly when. And it's still around, but I'm sure it would not be just brought out as is. It might be brought
Probably
out
wouldn't.
for inspiration sometime.
But,
To begin another conversation.
But given our experience 18 years ago, and given the positive impact that has had on our church today, and don't be surprised if in the next decade or so we embark on another phase of growth.
I think it's going to happen sometime.
I do too.
And I believe that master plan includes a chapel also.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've probably just now answered this, but do you feel that the question to each of you, one at a time, you feel that your participation in this part of the history of McFarland has had a special effect on your life? I think you probably both answered it, but you might want to bring it all together as one statement.
Right. Well, I shared about my youth, and wow, what great experience for a mom to get to see, for me as a mom, to get to see my children experience, the choirs and the bell choirs and the trips and the mission trips. Scott Meyer came the year that we married, I believe, and a typical length for most ministers, youth ministers, is about 3 years, and to have him from Sydney's beginning to end, and Anna Carmen, and so to watch my children get to have so many of my great joys with this church, and now they are having those musical and youth mission. That's
Anything you need to
my
add?
favorites.
I do have a sense of personal pride over seeing the new building and knowing that I and Terry participated heavily in that point of time in our church. But honestly, I look at it and I see it as a congregational accomplishment, and everybody had an important role to play. That was the whole point. Let's get everybody involved. So it's not 10 people trying to raise $3 million for a new wing. That would have never worked. The only way to make that work is to get everybody, all the Sunday school classes, all the ages, everybody buying into the process. And we were able to do that. And I hope everybody that has been a member of this church since then and now has a great sense of accomplishment like I have when you look at that addition. Because we did it right, didn't we? I mean, it is as beautiful as the original McFarlin structure. And there was no way that we could have, put a different kind of brick. We needed to have the limestone to make it look good, to make it look as good as the original. So I just think it goes together perfectly. Yes. And very, very proud of the church building and the church as a congregation.
Well, I believe that kind of wraps it up. That's a good way to end.
Good.
And I appreciate both of you so much for taking time this afternoon to come by and
thank you for your efforts.
Spend this time talking with us.
We're gonna just really be glad that this history has been recorded.
I think
Sunday.
so. Yeah. I've been, in fact, this morning I was just kind of contemplating how we're going to store these things and make them available.
Yeah.
That's something to work out here.
Yes.
Hope we can get it done while we're still historians.
Maybe there's somebody in our church that can, we can preserve the archives, but they can put together an hour-long video that we could we could have on our website. Just everybody.
That's what Joe is especially anxious to get something about the history onto the website.
Yeah.
Well, you recorded a lot of great stories, I'm sure, and it would be a huge effort to go through and select pieces and edit it all together. I mean, this is one of the most challenging ways to build a video, is just let people talk and then try to pick the pieces that you want to share. But it'd be great if somebody had the